As the moonlight bathed the quiet countryside in silver, a small, helpless puppy stood paralyzed in fear, surrounded by the eerie glow of the coyote's eyes closing in. It seemed as though the young pup's fate was sealed. But then, something unbelievable happened. A savior, out of nowhere, emerged from the darkness, leaving everyone in stunned silence. The countryside that night was eerily still. The only sound was the gentle rustling of leaves stirred by the wind, interrupted now and then by the distant howls of coyotes echoing across the valley. It was a typical evening in this rural part of the world, peaceful yet untouched by civilization, where the untamed wilderness reigned. But tonight, the quiet would soon be broken by an extraordinary turn of events. Nestled on the outskirts of a dense forest, a modest farmhouse stood. Inside, an elderly couple, Mr. and Mrs. Sanders, were finishing their evening tea. Known in the community for their love of animals, they often took in strays, nursing them back to health with tender care. Outside, their farm animals were resting peacefully in the barn, blissfully unaware of the danger lurking beyond. A small, scruffy puppy named Bailey had wandered onto their property not long ago. His golden fur was matted and his body thin, yet his eyes held a glimmer of hope. The Sanders had found him a week earlier, trembling near the porch, and had since been tending to his needs. Though still cautious, Bailey had begun to venture a little further from the house, but he always kept his tail tucked, retreating in fear at the slightest sound. That evening, Bailey had been playing by the barn, chasing fireflies and exploring the cool grass beneath his tiny paws. The moon hung high, casting a pale glow over the landscape, and the air was crisp and still. But as Bailey ventured closer to the edge of the forest, an unsettling sound cut through the calm, a deep, guttural growl. The puppy froze, ears standing at attention. From the shadows of the trees, pairs of eyes glimmered, their reflection a sinister shade of green. A pack of coyotes was closing in, silent, predatory, and intent on their prey. Bailey stood frozen, trembling as the coyotes emerged from the darkness. Their sleek bodies moved with unnerving precision, low growls vibrating the air around them. At the forefront was a large alpha, its sharp teeth gleaming under the moonlight. The coyote's eyes locked onto Bailey, its gaze filled with hunger. The puppy stepped back, letting out a frightened whimper, but fear had a grip on him. His tiny legs wouldn't carry him away from the encroaching danger. Inside the farmhouse, Mr. Sanders glanced toward the window, sensing something wasn't quite right. He peered outside but saw nothing out of the ordinary in the faint light. Shrugging it off, he returned to his tea, unaware of the imminent threat on the other side of the barn. Bailey tried to retreat, his paws slipping on the damp ground, but the coyotes closed in. The circle around him tightened, their growls growing louder, their bodies shifting into more aggressive stances. The alpha coyote barked sharply, signaling the pack to prepare for the kill. In desperation, Bailey let out a high-pitched howl, a cry of terror that echoed through the night. The coyotes hesitated, momentarily startled by the unexpected sound, but the pause was brief. Hunger soon overpowered their caution. With a collective lunge, the pack moved closer, their teeth bared. Bailey, trembling uncontrollably, crouched low to the ground, his body shaking with fear. The situation was dire, hopeless. But then, from the distant shadows, a deep, resonating growl filled the air, far more powerful than anything the coyotes could muster. The growl rippled through the valley, halting the coyotes in their tracks. They turned toward the forest, ears twitching as the growl grew louder and more pronounced. Slowly, from From the dark trees emerged a large, shadowy figure. The moonlight caught its massive form, revealing thick, shaggy fur and piercing amber eyes. It was a wolf, not just any wolf, but the legendary lone wolf said to roam these parts. Whispers of this creature had circulated for years. Locals referred to it as the guardian of the forest. The coyotes, sensing a new and far more formidable threat, took a cautious step back. Even the alpha hesitated, its tail lowering as it assessed the situation. The wolf stepped forward with purposeful grace, its amber eyes locked onto the pack. It was clear this wasn't just another predator. Its presence demanded respect. Bailey's wide eyes flicked nervously between the wolf and the coyotes, unsure of what was unfolding before him. The wolf lowered its head slightly, its ears flattened against its skull, and let out another deep growl. A sound that sent chills down the spines of the coyotes, their earlier bravado rapidly evaporating. The alpha coyote, unwilling to give up its prey without a fight, let out a defiant bark, urging its pack to stand firm. But the wolf didn't flinch. It lunged forward, its movements quick and powerful, catching the alpha by surprise. The coyote narrowly dodged the wolf's massive paw, scrambling backward with a terrified yelp. Realizing they stood no chance against the lone wolf, the coyotes began to retreat, their growls turning into frantic yelps. The wolf chased them a short distance, ensuring they wouldn't return, before abruptly stopping and turning back toward Bailey. The little puppy remained frozen, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and awe. The wolf approached Bailey slowly, its massive form towering over the tiny dog. For a moment, Bailey cowered, uncertain of the wolf's intentions. But then, to his astonishment, the wolf lowered itself to the ground, its posture calm and deliberate. It let out a soft, reassuring growl as though to say, "You're safe now." Bailey's ears perked up, and he took a tentative step closer. The wolf stayed still, its amber eyes gentle yet alert. Slowly, Bailey's fear began to ebb, replaced by a growing trust. Meanwhile, inside the farmhouse, Mrs. Sanders had heard the commotion. She stepped outside with a flashlight, calling for Bailey. The beam of light swept across the yard, revealing the astonishing sight of the wolf and the puppy together. Her gasp was sharp, her hand flying to her mouth as she took in the scene. "John!" she called, her voice trembling. "Come quickly!" Mr. Sanders rushed outside, his eyes widening in disbelief at the sight of the wolf. Without thinking, he reached for the shotgun by the door, but his wife stopped him. "Wait," she said, her voice calm yet firm. "I don't think it's here to harm us." The wolf turned its head toward the humans, its amber eyes meeting theirs for a brief moment. An unspoken understanding seemed to pass between them, a silent agreement. Then, with one final glance at Bailey, the wolf turned and retreated back into the forest. Bailey, still trembling but now safe, padded back toward the Sanders, his tail wagging cautiously. Mrs. Sanders scooped him up into her arms, her heart racing from the shock of the surreal encounter. "Did you see that, John?" she whispered, awe in her voice. "That wolf saved him." John nodded, his grip on the shotgun loosening. "I've never seen anything like it. That wasn't just a wild animal. It acted like—" He trailed off, unable to articulate what he had just witnessed. They carried Bailey back into the farmhouse, checking him for injuries. Fortunately, the puppy was unharmed, though visibly shaken. As Mrs. Sanders stroked his fur, Bailey let out a small whine and snuggled closer to her, seeking comfort. "That wolf," John muttered, pacing the kitchen. "It didn't just chase off those coyotes. It protected Bailey like it knew him." Mrs. Sanders frowned, her hand pausing mid-stroke. "Do you think it's been watching him?" Maybe it's been around the farm before and we just didn't notice. The thought sent a chill down her spine. If the wolf had been near their property, why had it stayed hidden? And why would a wild predator go out of its way to protect a helpless puppy? The mystery lingered in the back of their minds as they prepared for bed. Bailey, refusing to leave their side, curled up on the rug at the foot of their bed. But sleep was elusive for the Sanders. Images of the wolf, its amber eyes, and the growls of the coyotes continued to haunt their thoughts. The next morning, John set out to investigate further. Armed with a camera and a newfound determination, he ventured into the woods, following the path where the wolf had disappeared. Bailey, sensing his owner's intent, tried to follow, but John gently scooped him up and handed him to Mrs. Sanders. "Stay here," he said firmly. "I don't know what's out there, and I don't want either of you getting hurt." The forest was eerily quiet as John moved deeper into the trees, sunlight filtering through the canopy, casting dappled shadows on the forest floor. He paused occasionally, looking for any sign of the wolf, tracks, fur, or anything to confirm its presence. Hours passed without any luck, but John pressed on, unwilling to give up. Finally, he stumbled upon a small clearing where a group of rocks lay arranged in a deliberate pattern, almost like a den. Scattered around were tufts of fur and remnants of bones, clear signs of past meals. But what caught his eye was something far more unexpected, a small tattered collar, half buried in the dirt. Kneeling, John picked it up and examined it. Though old and frayed, a faint engraving on the tag remained visible. "Shadow. Shadow," John muttered to himself, turning the collar over in his hands. Who was Shadow? And what connection did it have to the wolf? As he stood, a low growl rumbled from the edge of the clearing. John froze, his heart racing as he turned toward the sound. Emerging from the shadows was the wolf, its amber eyes fixed on him, unblinking and intense. Slowly, John raised his hands, still holding the collar. "Easy," he said softly, keeping his voice steady despite the pounding in his chest. "I'm not here to hurt you." The wolf took a cautious step forward, its gaze flicking between John and the collar. For a moment, it seemed to hesitate, as if weighing whether to trust him. Then, to John's astonishment, the wolf let out a soft whine and sat back on its haunches, no longer displaying any threat. John extended the collar toward it, watching as the wolf sniffed the air. "Is this yours?" he asked, almost feeling foolish speaking to a wild animal. But the wolf's response was anything but ordinary. It lowered its head, letting out another gentle whine, pawing at the ground. A realization struck John like lightning. This was no ordinary wolf. Shadow wasn't just a name, it was an identity. "Shadow," John said again, testing the name. The wolf's ears perked slightly, confirming his suspicion. This creature had once been someone's pet, a companion turned guardian. But how had it ended up here? And why had it chosen to protect Bailey? The wolf's posture shifted abruptly, its body tensing as its gaze fixed on the depths of the forest. A soft rustle, barely perceptible to the human ear, crept from the shadows. Something was coming. Shadow emitted a low warning growl, and John instinctively knew it was time to retreat. "Yeah, you're right," John muttered under his breath, slowly inching away from the clearing. "I'll go, but this isn't over." His grip on the collar tightened, his thoughts racing. There were too many questions, and each one led deeper into the mystery of Shadow's connection to the puppy and to the unsettling events surrounding them. John wasn't about to let this go. Once back at the farmhouse, John eagerly shared his discovery with Mrs. Sanders. The collar, still clutched in his hand, seemed to hold the answers to a story they were only beginning to understand. Mrs. Sanders ran her fingers over the name engraved on the worn leather. "So, it belonged to someone?" she asked softly, her voice thick with disbelief. John nodded, his brow furrowed. "It's more than that. This wolf, Shadow, he's not just protecting Bailey by accident. There's a reason for it." Bailey, sensing the tension in the room, whined softly, pawing at the collar with his tiny paws. It tugged at John's heart, further solidifying his determination to uncover the truth. "We need to know who Shadow really is," he said, with newfound resolve, "and why he's protecting Bailey. There's more to this than we realize." The kitchen was heavy with an air of curiosity and unease as Mrs. Sanders continued to study the collar. She seemed to search for answers in its faded leather, but there were none to be found. "It's hard to believe," she murmured. "The wolf, it's as if it hasn't forgotten who it used to be." John placed a hand gently on Bailey's head, the puppy now curled up at his feet. "It's not just instinct," he replied. "Shadow recognized the collar. There's a history there, and I'm going to figure it out." Mrs. Sanders hesitated. "Do you think it's safe? I mean, this is still a wild animal. What if it's dangerous?" John leaned back, considering the question carefully. "I don't think it's dangerous. If Shadow had wanted to hurt Bailey, or us, he would have had plenty of chances. Instead, he's been protecting us. There's something more going on here." Just then, Bailey stirred in his sleep, his tiny whine breaking the silence. Mrs. Sanders smiled faintly, reaching down to scoop him up. "Whatever Shadow's reasons, one thing's for sure," she said softly. "Bailey trusts him, and that means something." For the next few days, John's mind never left the mystery surrounding Shadow. Driven to uncover the truth, he dove into research, reaching out to local animal shelters, wildlife experts, and even combing through online forums. He was determined to find any clue that might explain Shadow's past. Then, one evening, while scrolling through a community page for missing pets, John stumbled upon a post that made his heart race. There, among the photos of lost pets, was a wolf-like dog with striking amber eyes. Beneath the image was the name, Shadow. The post was dated several years ago and described the heart-wrenching tale of a family who had lost their beloved pet. Shadow had vanished during a camping trip in the woods, and despite desperate searches, the family had never found him. "This has to be it," John whispered to himself, his pulse quickening. He quickly copied down the contact information and dialed the number, his fingers trembling as the phone rang. A woman's voice answered, cautious but hopeful. "Hello?" "Hi, my name's John Sanders," John said, nearly out of breath. "I think I've found your dog, Shadow." There was a long pause before the woman spoke again, her voice thick with emotion. "Shadow? You found him? Where is he?" John explained everything, how he had found the collar, Shadow's behavior, and how the wolf had been watching over Bailey. The woman, introduced as Laura, listened intently, her voice trembling as the realization set in. "That's him!" she exclaimed. "That's our Shadow. I can't believe he's still alive. We thought we'd lost him forever." Laura then told John more about Shadow, how he had once been more than just a pet to her family. He had been a protector, saving her young son from an aggressive stray dog. But during a camping trip years ago, Shadow had heard coyotes howling in the distance and had run off into the night, never to return. Despite their efforts to find him, he had simply vanished. John's mind raced as the pieces began to fall into place. Shadow's protective instincts, his fierce loyalty to Bailey, it all made sense now. The wolf had probably encountered the coyotes that night and had learned to survive in the wild, all while retaining the strong bond he had once shared with Laura's family. "You need to come see him," John said, his voice filled with urgency. "Shadow's still out there, and I think he's been watching over us." Laura hesitated. "I'll come right away. But what if he doesn't remember me? It's been so long." John spoke reassuringly. "If Shadow remembers anything, it's you. I'm sure of it." The following morning, Laura arrived at the Sanders farmhouse, a photo of Shadow clutched in her hand. Her eyes nervously scanned the woods as she approached John and Mrs. Sanders. John greeted her and led her to the edge of the forest, explaining that Shadow had been staying close by, seeking safety in the familiar woods. Laura nodded but looked apprehensive. "I just need to see him again. Even if he doesn't remember me, I need to know he's okay." They waited in silence, Bailey sitting quietly at their feet. Time stretched on, and just as the air seemed to grow heavy with disappointment, a familiar shape emerged from the shadows. Shadow stepped into the clearing, his amber eyes locking onto Laura. For a long moment, Shadow hesitated, his body tense, unsure of what to do. Then, Laura whispered his name, her voice thick with emotion. "Shadow ... The wolf's ears twitched, his posture slowly relaxing. He took a cautious step forward and then another. Then, as though a dam had finally broken, he lunged into her arms, his tail wagging furiously. Laura's voice cracked with emotion as she embraced the wolf, her tears streaming freely. "Oh my God, Shadow! I never thought I'd see you again." John and Mrs. Sanders stood in awe, watching the reunion unfold, their hearts swelling with joy. Bailey, ecstatic, barked in excitement and ran circles around the two of them, almost as if he too was welcoming Shadow home. The moment was an emotional resolution for Laura and Shadow, a reunion long awaited. But for John, this was just the beginning of a deeper mystery, one that tied Shadow to Bailey in a way he couldn't yet understand. Later, as Laura, Shadow, and the Sanders family sat together to share a meal, Bailey darted between them, joyfully nuzzling both Laura and Shadow. Laura stroked Shadow's fur, still in disbelief that he had come back. "This is incredible," she said, her voice full of wonder. "I never imagined I'd find him again, let alone discover he's been looking after another little one." John leaned forward, deep in thought. "Laura, there's something about all of this that doesn't add up. Shadow didn't just stumble upon us. It's like he's been watching over Bailey from the moment we found him." Laura furrowed her brow. "What are you suggesting?" "I think Shadow was meant to find you," John said slowly, glancing toward the woods. "Maybe it's fate, or maybe there's something about Bailey that drew him here." Before they could continue, the distant sound of howls echoed through the trees. John stiffened. "The Coyotes," he muttered. "They're back." Laura's face paled. "They've been a problem before." John nodded. "They've never come this close, not until now." Shadow's ears perked up, and with a protective stance, he moved toward the door, his eyes scanning the surroundings. Bailey ran up beside him, tail wagging, oblivious to the danger. "We need to keep them away from here," John said, grabbing a flashlight and his shotgun. "Laura, you and Mrs. Sanders stay inside with Bailey. I'll check the perimeter." Laura glanced at Shadow, a conflicted look on her face. "He wants to go with you." John nodded, understanding. "All right, Shadow, let's go." Together, John and the wolf dog ventured into the fading twilight, the distant howls growing louder. Shadow moved with purpose, his every step guided by instinct as he led John closer to the source of the sound. As they reached a clearing, the scene before them made John's heart race. A pack of coyotes had gathered, their eyes glinting in the dim light. They snarled and snapped at each other, their movements erratic and aggressive. Shadow stepped forward, his fur bristling as he let out a deep, resonant bark. The coyotes froze, their attention snapping to him. For a moment, there was silence, a standoff between predator and protector. John gripped his shotgun tightly, ready to intervene if necessary. But before he could act, something unexpected happened. One of the coyotes, larger than the rest, stepped forward. It was missing part of its ear, and its body bore scars from countless battles. Shadow didn't growl or bark at this coyote. Instead, he stiffened, his posture changing from aggressive to wary. The two animals stared at each other, a silent exchange passing between them. "What is this?" John muttered under his breath. The larger coyote let out a low, guttural sound, almost like a growl but softer. Shadow responded with a series of short, sharp barks, his tail wagging slightly, not in submission, but in recognition. It was clear to John that these two had a history. The larger coyote wasn't just any pack leader, it was someone Shadow knew from his time in the wild. The standoff ended as abruptly as it began. The scarred coyote turned and barked at the rest of the pack, signaling them to retreat. One by one, the coyotes slinked back into the shadows, their howls fading into the night. Shadow stood motionless, watching until the last coyote disappeared. Then, with a huff, he turned and walked back toward John, his demeanor calm but alert. "What just happened?" John asked, kneeling to examine Shadow's expression. "You knew him, didn't you?" Shadow didn't respond, of course, but his eyes seemed to hold a depth of understanding that unnerved John. When they returned to the farmhouse, John recounted the encounter to Laura and Mrs. Sanders. Laura's face turned pale as she listened. "If Shadow knew the pack leader," she said, "that means he must have been part of a coyote pack at some point. But why would he leave them to protect Bailey?" Mrs. Sanders, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. "Maybe he didn't leave them. Maybe he chose Bailey because he saw something worth protecting. A family, just like the one he lost." John nodded slowly, his thoughts racing. Shadow's past was becoming clearer, but it raised more questions than answers. What had driven him to leave the pack, and why did the coyotes listen to him? That night, as the family settled in for the evening, Shadow remained by the door, his amber eyes scanning the dark forest. Bailey curled up beside him, his tiny body pressed against the larger dog's side. John watched them, a sense of unease lingering in his chest. Shadow's presence was a gift, but it was also a mystery, one that John knew he couldn't ignore. "Tomorrow," he said quietly, "we're going to find out the truth." The following morning, the first rays of sunlight pierced through the thick clouds, illuminating the Sanders farmhouse. Inside, a sense of urgency filled the air. John had barely slept, his thoughts consumed by the previous night's encounter with the coyotes and the strange bond between Shadow and their leader. As the family gathered for breakfast, Shadow sat by the door, alert as ever. Bailey, as carefree as only a puppy could be, pawed at Shadow, his small tail wagging furiously. Shadow responded with a soft nudge, his protective instincts seemingly at odds with an unspoken burden. John sat down, his coffee cup landing with a determined thud. "We need answers," he said. "Shadow isn't just any dog. He's tied to something bigger. Last night proved that." Laura nodded, her expression serious. "I've spent years rescuing and rehabilitating animals, but I've never seen behavior like Shadow's. He isn't just protecting Bailey out of instinct. There's something deeper here. I want to know what brought him to you." Mrs. Sanders, ever the pragmatic voice, chimed in. "If you're going to search for answers, where do you even start? Shadow can't exactly tell you his life story." John glanced at Shadow, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. "Maybe not with words," he admitted, "but actions speak louder. There's a reason he came here, and a reason the coyotes listened to him. If we follow his lead, he might show us." Laura agreed. "I'll go with you. Shadow trusts me, and 2 pairs of eyes are better than 1. Mrs. Sanders looked skeptical but didn't object. "Just be careful. The woods aren't always kind to strangers." The plan was set, with supplies packed, and Bailey left safely in Mrs. Sanders's care. John and Laura followed Shadow into the dense forest. The crisp morning air carried a hint of pine and damp earth, but the woods themselves seemed unnervingly silent. Shadow led the way with unwavering confidence, his nose to the ground and his ears twitching at every sound. "Do you think he's leading us to the pack?" Laura whispered, breaking the silence. "Maybe," John replied. "Or maybe he's showing us something he left behind." They walked in silence for nearly an hour, the forest growing denser with each step. Shadow finally paused at the edge of a rocky clearing. His body stiffened, his ears perked forward, and a low growl escaped his throat. "What is it?" Laura asked, scanning the area. John spotted movement in the distance, a flash of fur and a pair of glowing eyes. "Coyotes," he said, his voice tense. The pack had returned, but this time they weren't circling or snarling. Instead, they stayed at a cautious distance, their eyes fixed on Shadow. Among them, the scarred leader stepped forward. His posture was neither aggressive nor submissive. It was as if he was waiting. Shadow took a step forward, his tail wagging low but steady. He let out a series of soft barks and growls, his body language almost conversational. The scarred coyote responded in kind, his movements measured and deliberate. John and Laura exchanged bewildered looks. "They're communicating," Laura whispered. "It's like they're negotiating." The exchange continued for several minutes until the scarred coyote let out a sharp bark. The pack began to retreat into the woods, their movements smooth and unthreatening. The leader lingered for a moment longer, locking eyes with Shadow before disappearing into the trees. "What just happened?" John asked, his voice filled with awe. Laura knelt beside Shadow, stroking his fur. "It's like they came to an understanding. Shadow isn't just a protector, he's a mediator. He knows how to navigate both worlds, ours and theirs." But the encounter left John with more questions. If Shadow can keep the coyotes at bay, why did they attack Bailey in the first place? What changed? Laura's expression darkened. Maybe they weren't hunting. Maybe they were trying to send a message. The theory unsettled them both. Coyotes were opportunistic predators, but the idea of them having a deeper motive was almost too much to comprehend. As they continued through the forest, Shadow led them to a secluded area where the trees thinned out, revealing a makeshift den nestled between 2 large boulders. The den appeared abandoned, its entrance overgrown with weeds and littered with old bones. Shadow sniffed the ground intently, his posture growing more agitated. He pawed at the dirt near the entrance, uncovering a faded collar buried beneath the leaves. Laura picked it up, her eyes widening. "This belonged to another dog," she said, turning it over in her hands. "Here, it's old, but there's still a name etched on the tag. Dakota." "Dakota?" John repeated. "Do you think Shadow knew him?" "I don't know," Laura admitted. "But this could be the key to understanding his past." Shadow whimpered softly, his gaze fixed on the collar. It was clear that the discovery had stirred something in him, memories perhaps, or a connection to a life he had left behind. "We need to find out who Dakota was," Laura said, her voice resolute, "and why Shadow brought us here." As they made their way back to the farmhouse, the collar weighed heavily in Laura's pocket. The forest seemed to watch them, its secrets only partially revealed. For every answer they found, new questions arose, drawing them deeper into the mystery of Shadow's life and his unbreakable bond with Bailey. The farmhouse felt different when John, Laura, and Shadow returned. Mrs. Sanders greeted them with relief, Bailey yipping happily at Shadow's heels. Yet a heavy unease lingered in the air, a sense that the forest had whispered secrets to them that couldn't be ignored. Laura placed the old collar on the kitchen table, its faded lettering a tangible piece of the puzzle. "Dakota," she murmured, tracing the name with her finger. "Who was he, and what does this have to do with Shadow?" John, leaning against the counter, stared at the collar with a furrowed brow. If Shadow knew Dakota, then this place, this den, might have been important to both of them. It explains why Shadow led us there, but it doesn't explain the Coyotes' behavior. Mrs. Sanders chimed in, her voice steady but concerned. "Coyotes don't act like this without a reason. You're dealing with something more than just a pack protecting its territory." Shadow, lying near Bailey, perked up at her words. His ears twitched, and his amber eyes locked onto Laura as though urging her to understand. Could Dakota have been part of their story too? Laura speculated. Maybe Shadow and Dakota were connected to the pack somehow. John nodded slowly. It's possible. We've seen Shadow's ability to communicate with them. If Dakota was involved with the Coyotes, it might explain why Shadow has such an influence over them. But Laura couldn't shake an uncomfortable thought. What if Shadow isn't just a mediator? What if he's carrying guilt or unfinished business from whatever happened with Dakota? The conversation was interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. John frowned, glancing at Laura before heading to open it. On the porch stood a weathered man in his late 60s, wearing a thick jacket and a wide-brimmed hat. His eyes held a mixture of curiosity and caution. "Can I help you?" John asked, his tone polite but wary. The man tipped his hat. "Name's Earl. I live a couple of miles down the road. Heard you've been having some trouble with coyotes." John stepped aside to let Earl in, motioning for him to take a seat. "We've had a few run-ins," he admitted. "What do you know about them?" Earl settled into a chair, his gaze sweeping over the room before landing on Shadow. "That's a fine dog you've got there," he said, his tone thoughtful. "But he's not just any dog, is he?" Laura stiffened. "What do you mean?" Earl leaned forward, his weathered hands resting on his knees. "Years ago, there was a dog named Dakota in these parts. He was a protector, like your Shadow, but he had a deeper connection to the wild. Folks around here used to say Dakota was a bridge between the human world and the coyotes." John exchanged a glance with Laura. "A bridge?" Earl nodded. Dakota wasn't just leading or protecting, he was mediating, keeping the balance. But something happened, something that tore that balance apart. After Dakota disappeared, the coyotes changed. They grew more aggressive, less predictable. It's like they lost their compass. Laura glanced at the collar on the table. "We found this near an abandoned den. Could it have belonged to Dakota?" Earl picked up the collar, his fingers brushing over the worn leather. His expression grew somber. "That's his, all right. Haven't seen it in years. If you found this, then Shadow must be trying to finish what Dakota started." "But why?" John asked, his frustration evident. "What's Shadow's role in all of this?" Earl looked at Shadow, his eyes narrowing thoughtfully. "Maybe Shadow's here to restore what was lost. Coyotes don't forget easily, and if they respected Dakota, they'll listen to a dog they see as his successor." The weight of Earl's words hung heavy in the room. Shadow shifted, rising to his feet and moving to stand by the door. His body was tense, his gaze fixed on the forest beyond the window. "He wants to go back," Laura said, reading his body language. "There's more he needs to show us." Earl stood, placing the collar back on the table. If you're going into the woods again, be careful. Coyotes are coming, and if they see you as a threat, they won't hesitate." John grabbed his jacket, his jaw set. "Then we'll make sure they don't see us as a threat. Shadow wouldn't lead us into something we couldn't handle." Laura joined him, her resolve matching his. "We'll follow his lead again. This time, maybe we'll find answers about Dakota and about Shadow's place in all of this." As the trio prepared to venture back into the forest, Mrs. Sanders watched from the porch, Bailey tucked safely in her arms. "Hey, come back in one piece," she called, her voice laced with both worry and hope. With Earl's warnings fresh in their minds, John, Laura, and Shadow stepped into the woods once more. The trees seemed to close around them, the light fading as they followed Shadow's determined pace. The forest was alive with sounds, rustling leaves, distant howls, but there was an undercurrent of tension, as though the land itself held its breath. Shadow led them deeper than before, his movement swift and purposeful. Every so often he paused to sniff the ground or listen intently, his tail low and steady. Laura couldn't help but marvel at his focus. It was as if he carried an unspoken knowledge, a map etched into his very being. Hours passed, and the forest grew darker, the canopy above blocking out what little sunlight remained. Just as Laura was about to suggest turning back, Shadow stopped abruptly, his body rigid. "What is it?" Laura whispered. Shadow let out a low growl, his gaze fixed on a shadowy figure emerging from the trees. It was the scarred coyote leader, flanked by two smaller members of the pack. Their presence was not threatening, but deliberate, as though they had been waiting. "They're here to guide us," Laura murmured, her voice filled with a mixture of awe and apprehension. John nodded, gripping the flashlight slightly tighter. "Then let's see where they take us." The scarred coyote held its ground, its golden eyes glowing faintly in the dim light filtering through the canopy. Beside it, the two smaller coyotes shifted uneasily, their ears twitching at every sound. Shadow stepped forward, his posture confident but non-threatening, as though signaling to the humans that it was safe to follow. Laura hesitated, gripping John's arm. "Are we really going to trust them?" she whispered. John's gaze didn't waver from the coyote. "Shadow does," he replied, "and he's the only guide we've got." The scarred coyote let out a soft, low growl, not of aggression, but communication. Shadow responded with a similar sound, his tail swaying slightly as he approached the coyotes. After a tense moment, the leader turned and began walking into the dense woods, its packmates close behind. Shadow glanced back at Laura and John, urging them to follow with a nod. John tightened his grip on the flashlight and stepped forward, Laura close behind. "They have Shadow leading us," John said. "I'll trust him." The path the coyotes led them on was unlike any they'd traversed before. The forest thickened, its shadows growing deeper and more oppressive. Roots jutted out from the ground like the gnarled hands of giants, threatening to trip them with every step. Yet Shadow and the coyotes navigated the terrain effortlessly, their movements fluid and deliberate. "Where are they taking us?" Laura asked, her voice barely audible over the rustling leaves. John shook his head. "I don't know. But they've got a purpose. Look at Shadow. He knows this isn't random." The deeper they ventured, the more the forest seemed to come alive. Distant howls echoed through the trees, blending with the calls of nocturnal birds and the rustle of unseen creatures. The air grew colder, carrying with it the earthy scent of moss and damp soil. Every sound seemed amplified, every shadow sharper. Suddenly, the scarred coyote stopped, its ears perking up as it sniffed the air. Shadow mirrored its movements, his amber eyes scanning the surroundings. A low, guttural growl rumbled from the coyote's throat, and its packmates crouched low, their fur bristling. "What's going on?" Laura whispered, her pulse quickening. Shadow growled in response, his body tense and alert. John raised his flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness, and what he saw sent a chill down his spine. Dozens of glowing eyes stared back at them from the shadows. A larger group of coyotes, their bodies barely visible in the underbrush, surrounded them. The tension was palpable, the air thick with uncertainty. "Are they threatening us?" Laura asked, panic creeping into her voice. "I don't think so," John replied, though his grip on the flashlight tightened. "If they wanted to attack, they would have done it by now." The scarred coyote stepped forward, its head held high as it let out a series of sharp, deliberate barks. The surrounding coyotes responded in kind, their cries echoing through the forest like a chorus. Shadow added his voice to the mix, his howl carrying an almost mournful note that sent shivers down Laura's spine. "It's like they're talking," she said, her fear giving way to awe. "But what are they saying?" The scarred coyote moved closer to Shadow, its body language shifting from tense to almost reverent. It lowered its head slightly, as though acknowledging Shadow's authority. The other coyotes followed suit, their postures becoming less aggressive. John exhaled slowly, his shoulders relaxing. They're accepting him, he realized. Shadow isn't just leading us, he's leading them. As if to confirm John's words, the scarred coyote turned and began moving again, this time with the larger group following closely behind. Shadow took his place at the leader's side, his stride confident and purposeful. Laura glanced at John, her expression a mix of fear and determination. "We have to keep going," she said. "Whatever this is, it's bigger than we thought." The journey continued, the human pair now flanked by the silent, watchful coyotes. The pack moved with eerie synchronicity, their paws barely making a sound on the forest floor. The deeper they went, the more the forest seemed to change. The trees grew taller and older, their knotted branches forming a dense canopy that blocked out the stars. The air grew colder, and the faint sound of running water reached their ears. Finally, the group emerged into a clearing, and what lay before them took their breath away. A massive ancient tree stood at the center, its roots twisting and sprawling across the ground like the veins of the earth itself. The tree's bark was scarred and weathered, yet it emanated an almost palpable sense of strength and wisdom. At its base was a large, shallow depression, filled with crystal-clear water reflecting the moonlight like a mirror. This is it," Laura whispered, her voice trembling with awe. "This is what Shadow wanted us to find." The scarred coyote approached the water, lowering its head to drink. The other coyotes followed, their movements calm and deliberate. Shadow stood at the edge of the clearing, his gaze fixed on the ancient tree as though it held the answers to every question. John and Laura stepped closer, their eyes darting between Shadow and the massive tree. "What is this place?" John wondered aloud. "It feels sacred," Laura replied, her voice barely above a whisper, "like it's been here forever." Shadow turned to them, his eyes meeting Laura's. In that moment, she felt an overwhelming sense of purpose, as though Shadow was telling her they had reached the heart of the mystery. But the journey wasn't over. Something was still missing, something they had yet to uncover. Just as the group absorbed the quiet beauty of the moment, the stillness was shattered by an eerie, guttural howl. It came from the forest behind them, a sound deeper and more menacing than any coyote call they'd ever heard. Shadow stiffened, his ears perked, and his fur bristled. The coyotes, too, reacted with unease, their movements becoming restless. "What was that?" Laura whispered, gripping John's arm tightly. John scanned the surrounding trees, his flashlight beam cutting through the shadows. "Something's out there," he said grimly, "and it's not friendly." The scarred coyote stepped forward, letting out a sharp bark that echoed through the clearing. The other coyotes rallied around it, forming a loose defensive circle. Shadow positioned himself near Laura and John, his stance protective and ready. Suddenly, movement rustled in the underbrush at the edge of the clearing. Eyes glinted in the darkness, multiple pairs, larger and more sinister than those of the coyotes. The growling intensified, and then they emerged, a pack of wolves, their massive forms illuminated in the pale moonlight. The wolves were unlike anything they'd encountered before. The wolves that Laura and John faced were unlike any they had ever seen, their fur dark and matted, their eyes gleaming with a supernatural intensity. The leader, a towering black wolf with jagged scars across its muzzle, stepped forward, baring its teeth in a menacing snarl. "That's not just any wolf," John muttered, his voice tense. "It's the pack alpha, and it looks like it's here to challenge the coyotes." The wolves advanced slowly, their movements calculated and predatory. The scarred coyote barked defiantly, stepping forward to confront the alpha. Shadow joined him, standing tall and unwavering, his gaze locked on the approaching threat. Laura's heart pounded in her chest. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice trembling. "We stay back," John said firmly, pulling her behind him. "This is their fight." The tension in the clearing was palpable as the two groups faced off, the wolves snarling and snapping their jaws, asserting their dominance. But the coyotes did not back down. The scarred coyote let out a rallying howl, and the pack responded in unison, their voices rising into the night air. Shadow added his voice to the chorus, his howl deep and commanding. The alpha wolf lunged forward, its massive jaws snapping just inches from the scarred coyote's face. The coyote dodged nimbly, its movements quick and precise. Shadow darted in, snarling fiercely, forcing the wolf to retreat momentarily. The clearing erupted into chaos as the wolves and coyotes clashed. Teeth flashed, paws struck, and growls filled the air. Despite their smaller size, the coyotes fought with a ferocity born of desperation and unity, and Shadow moved like a whirlwind, his agility and strength unmatched as he defended both the coyotes and his human companions. Laura and John watched in stunned silence, their instincts screaming at them to flee, yet unable to tear their eyes away. The battle was both terrifying and awe-inspiring, a raw display of nature's brutality and resilience. The black wolf seemed to sense Shadow's significance and targeted him directly. With a powerful leap, it lunged at Shadow, aiming for his throat. Shadow met the attack head-on, their bodies colliding with a force that shook the ground. They rolled together, snapping and growling, each trying to gain the upper hand. "Shadow!" Laura cried, stepping forward instinctively. "Stay back!" John grabbed her arm, his voice urgent. "He can handle this." For a moment, it seemed the alpha wolf would overpower Shadow, but then something extraordinary happened. The scarred coyote, seeing Shadow in peril, let out a piercing howl and launched itself at the alpha. The other coyotes followed, their collective force driving the wolf back. Together, they formed a protective barrier around Shadow, their loyalty and courage shining in the face of overwhelming odds. The alpha wolf hesitated, its dominance challenged for the first time. It growled low, its golden eyes narrowing as it assessed the situation. Then, with a final snarl, it turned and retreated into the forest, the rest of the wolves following, their defeat evident in their slumped postures. As the forest fell silent, the coyotes stood victorious, their bodies bruised but their spirits unbroken. Shadow limped slightly as he approached Laura and John, his fur matted with dirt, but his eyes shining with pride. "You did it," Laura whispered, kneeling to wrap her arms around Shadow. "You saved us." John crouched beside them, his hand resting gently on Shadow's head. "You're incredible, buddy," he said softly. "But why? Why go through all of this?" The scarred coyote approached, its golden eyes meeting John's for a moment, as if conveying something beyond words. A shared understanding, a purpose that extended beyond the fight. Laura looked toward the ancient tree, its presence still and watchful. "There's something here," she murmured. "Something protecting." Shadow let out a low bark and turned toward the tree, his body language urging them to follow. The scarred coyote joined him, its gaze fixed on the humans. "Whatever it is," John said, rising to his feet, "we're about to find out." As Shadow and the scarred coyote moved purposefully toward the ancient tree, Laura and John exchanged a glance, their curiosity outweighing their exhaustion and fear. They stepped carefully over the disturbed earth and broken branches left from the earlier chaos. The tree loomed ahead, its gnarled branches twisting against the moonlit sky like skeletal arms. Its massive trunk was scarred by time and weather, but there was something majestic about its presence, something that demanded reverence. Shadow stopped at its base, his ears alert and his body tense, as if waiting for the humans to catch up. "What's so special about this tree?" Laura whispered, her breath visible in the cold night air. John shook his head. "I don't know, but Shadow and the coyotes clearly think it's important." The scarred coyote let out a low, mournful howl, and the other coyotes gathered around. Their golden eyes reflected an unspoken understanding. Shadow joined them, his posture firm yet respectful, as if paying tribute to an unseen force. John stepped closer, scanning the base of the tree with his flashlight. "There's something here," he said, his voice tinged with excitement. "Look." Laura crouched beside him, her gaze following the beam of light. Embedded in the roots was a hollow, partially obscured by moss and fallen leaves. It was deep enough to conceal something, or someone. "What's in there?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. John reached out cautiously, brushing away the debris. Inside, he found a small bundle wrapped in weathered fabric. The coyotes watched intently, their eyes following every movement. "Careful," Laura warned. "It could be dangerous." John nodded, but his fingers trembled slightly as he pulled the bundle free. As the fabric unfurled, it revealed an assortment of objects: an old leather-bound journal, a small locket, and a carved wooden figurine of a dog, its resemblance to Shadow uncanny. Laura gasped. "What is this?" John flipped open the journal, his hands shaking with both cold and anticipation. The pages were brittle, filled with faded handwriting. He skimmed the first few entries, his brow furrowing as he tried to make sense of the words. "It's a journal," he said, his voice laced with disbelief. "It belonged to someone who lived here decades ago. They wrote about this forest, the wildlife, and these coyotes." Laura leaned over his shoulder, her eyes scanning the delicate script. "Look at this," she said, pointing to an entry dated over 50 years ago. It read, "These woods are sacred, a haven for creatures who seek refuge. The coyotes, they are not mere animals, they are guardians. They protect something far greater than themselves, something the world has long forgotten." John's heart raced as he flipped through the pages. The entry spoke of a deep connection between the forest's wildlife and the land itself, hinting at an ancient bond that humans had once honored but gradually abandoned. The journal's author, a naturalist named Eleanor Reed, described how the coyotes had saved her life after an injury left her stranded in the forest. In gratitude, she dedicated her life to preserving their sanctuary. "Guardians," John murmured, glancing at the coyotes who stood watchfully around them. "They've been protecting this place for generations." Laura picked up the locket, opening it to reveal a small photograph of a woman, Eleanor, holding a dog that bore a striking resemblance to Shadow. The connection was undeniable, and the weight of the discovery settled heavily between them. "It's as if Shadow was destined to lead us here," Laura said, her voice filled with awe. Before they could process further, a sharp yip from the scarred coyote drew their attention. The pack had turned its focus back to the forest's edge, their bodies tense and alert. "They sense something," John said, rising to his feet. From the shadows, a figure emerged, human, but not familiar. The man was tall and wiry, dressed in rugged outdoor gear that suggested he was no stranger to the wilderness. He carried a rifle slung over his shoulder, his eyes cold and calculating. "Well, well," the man drawled, his voice dripping with condescension. "Looks like I stumbled on something interesting." Laura instinctively moved closer to Shadow, who stood protectively in front of her. His growl deepened. John stepped forward, his body blocking the man's path. "Who are you?" J.N. demanded. "What are you doing here?" The man smirked, his gaze flicking between the humans and the coyotes. "Name's Carter. Been tracking this pack for weeks. Didn't expect to find company, though." "Tracking them?" Laura asked, her voice tinged with suspicion. "Why?" Carter's smirk widened. "Coyotes fetch a good price. They're pelts, their territory. People pay for that kind of thing, and this pack's been a thorn in my side for too long." John's fists clenched. "You can't just hunt them. This forest is protected." Carter chuckled darkly. "Protected by who? A bunch of tree huggers and their fairy tales? Please, this land's ripe for the taking." The tension thickened as the coyotes growled in unison, their instincts perceiving Carter as a threat. Shadow stepped forward, his eyes locked on the man, his stance fearless. "You need to leave," John said firmly, his voice steady despite the growing fear in his chest. Carter's expression hardened. "Not a chance. I've got business here." He reached for his rifle, and Laura gasped, clutching John's arm. The coyotes began to encircle Carter, their movements deliberate and coordinated. Shadow growled louder, his body coiled like a spring, ready to strike. "Leave," John repeated, his voice rising with urgency. The standoff reached its breaking point as Carter raised his rifle, but before he could aim, Shadow lunged forward, a blur of motion. The clearing erupted into chaos once more, but this time, the battle wasn't between animals, it was between man and nature. Shadow lunged at Carter, his teeth bared, a deep growl rumbling from his chest. The coyotes moved as one, their instincts aligning to encircle the intruder. Carter stumbled backward, his grip faltering on the rifle as he tried to fend off the snarling animals. "Shadow, no!" Laura shouted, fear gripping her as she watched the confrontation unfold, but her words seemed to vanish into the cacophony of growls and Carter's frantic shouts. John grabbed Laura's arm, pulling her behind him. "Stay back," he ordered, his eyes darting between the coyotes and Carter. "They know what they're doing." Carter swung the rifle wildly, the butt of the weapon catching one of the coyotes on its flank. The animal yelped and darted back, but the others pressed closer, their teeth snapping at his boots. Shadow stayed at the forefront, his movements precise and calculated, as if guiding the pack. "You think you can scare me?" Carter spat, his voice trembling with anger. "I've faced worse than a pack of mutts." He raised the rifle again, aiming directly at Shadow. Time seemed to slow as Laura screamed, her voice cracking with desperation. But before Carter could fire, the scarred coyote charged from the side, slamming into him with surprising force. The impact knocked the rifle from his hands, sending it skidding across the dirt. Shadow seized the opportunity, leaping onto Carter's chest and pinning him to the ground. The man's panicked breaths came in sharp gasps as Shadow loomed over him, his teeth inches from Carter's face. The pack closed in, their growls forming a low, menacing chorus. "I call them off!" Carter shouted, his bravado crumbling into raw fear. "Get them off me!" John stepped forward cautiously, his voice firm but calm. "Shadow, enough." His words carried a mixture of authority and trust, and Shadow's ears twitched at the sound. For a moment, the tension hung thick in the air, but then with a low growl, Shadow stepped back, his posture still defensive but no longer aggressive. The pack followed his lead, retreating just enough to give Carter room to scramble to his feet. Carter stumbled backward, his eyes darting wildly between the humans and the coyotes. "You people are crazy," he muttered, wiping dirt from his face. "Ah, this isn't over." "Yes, it is," John said firmly, pointing to the rifle lying several feet away. "Take your gun and leave. Don't come back." Carter hesitated, frustration and humiliation twisting his features, but the sight of the coyotes still poised to strike left him with no choice. He retrieved the rifle, his movements slow and deliberate, then backed away into the shadows. As the forest swallowed him, the pack relaxed, their growls fading into silence. Shadow walked over to Laura, his tail wagging faintly, as if seeking reassurance. She knelt down, wrapping her arms around him and burying her face in his fur. "You were incredible," she whispered, her voice shaking with emotion. John joined them, placing a hand on Shadow's head. He knew what Shadow had done, what they all had done. The scarred coyote approached, its eyes meeting John's with a calm, almost knowing expression, as if acknowledging their shared victory. The other coyotes gathered around, their formation now more relaxed, their golden eyes glowing softly in the moonlight. As the adrenaline began to fade, Laura glanced back at the ancient tree. "That journal," she said suddenly. "Elena wrote about them being guardians. Do you think they were protecting something tonight?" John nodded slowly, his gaze shifting to the hollow where they had found the artifacts. "They've been protecting this forest for generations," he said. "And tonight, they protected us too." The pack began to disperse, their movements graceful and deliberate as they melted into the shadows. Only Shadow and the scarred coyote remained, watching as John and Laura gathered the journal, locket, and wooden figurine. "Let me take these back," John said. "We need to make sure Elena's story and their story are preserved." Laura smiled, her eyes glistening with tears. "And maybe it's time people started seeing them for what they really are, protectors, not predators." As they made their way back to the cabin, Shadow walked beside them, his head held high and his tail wagging gently. The scarred coyote lingered at the edge of the clearing, his silhouette framed by the moonlight. He let out a single mournful howl that echoed through the forest, a sound that carried both a warning and a promise. For John and Laura, the events of the night marked more than just a brush with danger. They were a revelation. They had witnessed something extraordinary, a connection between humans and nature that transcended fear and misunderstanding. And as they stepped into the warmth of the cabin, they knew their lives and their view of the wild would never be the same. The warmth of the cabin provided a stark contrast to the night's harrowing events, but Laura and John remained on edge. Shadow curled up by the hearth, his body visibly tired, but his spirit unbroken. Outside, the forest had fallen into an almost eerie silence, as if the land itself were catching its breath. Laura placed the journal, locket, and wooden figurine on the table, their presence feeling heavier now than before. Elena's story, she murmured, her fingers tracing the worn leather of the journal. We've uncovered something far bigger than we ever imagined. John nodded, his gaze fixed on the objects. And it's not just Elena's story anymore, he said. It's Shadow's, the pack's, ours. A soft knock interrupted their thoughts. John and Laura exchanged a wary glance. No one was supposed to be out here, especially at this hour. John grabbed the shotgun he kept by the door, his grip firm but his mind racing. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice steady. "It's Dr. Foster," came the response. The familiar voice of the local wildlife biologist was unexpected but reassuring. John opened the door cautiously to reveal Dr. Foster standing on the porch, her face lit by the glow of a lantern. "I got your message earlier," she said, stepping inside. Her eyes widened as she took in the scene, Shadow resting by the fire, the artifacts on the table, and the tension etched into John and Laura's faces. "What happened?" "It's a long story," John replied, closing the door behind her. "But the short version is, the pack saved us tonight." Dr. Foster's expression shifted from curiosity to disbelief. "The Coyotes? They protected you?" Laura nodded, her voice firm. "They didn't just protect us. They worked together, as if they understood exactly what was at stake. It wasn't random, Dr. Foster. They knew." Dr. Foster knelt beside Shadow, her trained eyes scanning the animal's injuries. "Incredible," she murmured, brushing her hand gently over his fur. "Coyotes are intelligent, but this is extraordinary." As Laura recounted the events of the evening, Dr. Foster's fascination grew. "I've studied packs like this for years, but I've never seen behavior like what you're describing. This kind of coordinated effort, this loyalty, it's unheard of." John leaned against the table, his arms crossed. "There's something more to this forest," he said. "It's not just about the wildlife. Elena's journal hints at it. This place, these creatures, they've been protecting something for generations." Dr. Foster's eyes darted to the journal. "May I?" she asked, gesturing to it. Laura hesitated for a moment before nodding. "It's why we're here, to understand." Dr. Foster flipped through the pages, her face a mixture of awe and concentration. The sketches of the pack, the detailed notes on their behavior, and Elena's reflections painted a picture of a bond between the coyotes and the land that went beyond instinct. She wasn't just observing them, Dr. Foster said, her voice barely above a whisper. She was part of their story. A sharp bark from Shadow drew their attention to the window. The scarred coyote stood at the edge of the clearing, his silhouette stark against the moonlit forest. He let out a low, mournful howl, and Shadow perked up, his body tense. "He's calling him," Laura said, her heart sinking. "They need him back." John sighed, his voice heavy with understanding. "He belongs with them." Dr. Foster stood, her gaze following the scarred coyote. "It's rare for a pack to accept an outsider, let alone one that's been away this long. If they're calling him, it means he's earned his place." Laura knelt beside Shadow, her hands trembling as she stroked his fur. "You've done so much for us," she said softly. "But it's time for you to go home." Shadow licked her hand, his eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and determination. Slowly he stood, his movements deliberate but steady. He walked to the door, pausing to look back at them one last time. Laura wiped away a tear as John opened the door. "Be safe," she whispered. Shadow trotted out into the clearing, his silhouette joining the scarred coyote. Together, they disappeared into the forest, their figures swallowed by the shadows. Dr. Foster placed a hand on Laura's shoulder. "What you've experienced tonight is rare," she said gently. "These animals, They've trusted you with their story. That's a gift." Laura nodded, her voice shaky but resolute. "We can't let their story end here." As the night deepened, the trio sat by the fire, their conversation turning to the future. John and Laura shared their plans to preserve the forest, to protect the legacy of Elena and the pack. Dr. Foster offered her support, promising to use her connections to bring attention to the area's ecological importance. Outside, the forest remained quiet, but it no longer felt empty. Somewhere in the distance, the pack was moving as one, their bond stronger than ever. And in the warmth of the cabin, John, Laura, and Dr. Foster felt the weight of the night's events settle into a profound clarity. They were now part of a story much larger than themselves, a story of connection, resilience, and the unbreakable ties between humans and the wild. The next morning, the forest seemed to awaken with a renewed sense of tranquility. The sunlight filtered through the trees, casting golden beams across the clearing where the cabin stood. Laura and John stepped outside, their breaths visible in the crisp morning air and their thoughts lingering on Shadow's departure. "It feels quieter," Laura said, her voice tinged with both loss and hope. John nodded, "But not empty. They're still out there, watching over this place." Dr. Foster joined them on the porch, holding a steaming cup of coffee. "Last night was extraordinary," she said. "It's rare to witness such a profound connection between humans and wildlife. You've become a part of their story." Laura glanced at the forest's edge where the scarred coyote had stood the night before. "And they've become a part of ours." As the three of them discussed their next steps, a plan began to take shape. The journal, the artifacts, and the events of the past few days were more than personal experiences. They were a call to action. Elena's work, Shadow's bravery, and the pack's bond needed to be shared with the world. "We'll start by documenting everything," Dr. Foster suggested. "The journal, your observations, even your encounters with Shadow. This story needs to reach people who can help protect this land," John added, "and we'll work with local conservation groups to ensure the forest and its wildlife are preserved. This place isn't just ours, it belongs to them." Over the following weeks, Laura and John immersed themselves in their newfound mission. They partnered with Dr. Foster to compile a comprehensive report on the forest's unique ecosystem and the remarkable behavior of the coyote pack. Photos of Shadow, sketches from Elena's journal, and detailed accounts of the pack's actions formed the heart of their presentation. Word of their efforts spread, drawing interest from conservationists, journalists, and even government officials. A local news outlet ran a story titled "The Guardians of the Forest, a tale of coyotes, courage, and connection," sparking widespread support for their cause. Meanwhile, Laura and John found solace in their growing connection to the land. Each hike through the forest brought new discoveries, signs of the pack's presence, the delicate beauty of wild flowers, and the subtle rhythms of nature. Shadow's absence was deeply felt, but his legacy lived on in every step they took. One afternoon, as Laura walked along the familiar path to the clearing, she noticed something unusual. A small bundle of twigs and leaves lay neatly arranged near the base of an ancient oak tree. Among them was a feather, its edges worn but its colors vibrant. It was a gift, she realized, a gesture of acknowledgement from the pack. Tears filled her eyes as she knelt to pick up the feather. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice carried away by the gentle breeze. Back at the cabin, she placed the feather alongside Elena's artifacts, creating a small shrine to honor the bond they had forged with the forest and its inhabitants. It became a symbol of hope, resilience, and the enduring spirit of connection. Months turned into seasons, and the forest thrived under the community's watchful care. the efforts of Laura, John, and Dr. Foster led to the establishment of a protected reserve, ensuring the land would remain a sanctuary for generations to come. Educational programs brought children and families to the area, fostering a deeper appreciation for the natural world. But the most profound moments were the quiet ones. When Laura and John would sit on the cabin's porch, gazing at the forest as the sun set, occasionally they would hear the distant howls of the pack, a reminder of the wild hearts that had touched their lives. One evening, as the sky turned a deep shade of indigo, Laura leaned against John and sighed. "Do you think Shadow remembers us?" she asked softly. John smiled, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I think he does, and I think he knows we'll never forget him." The call to action became a cornerstone of their story. Inspired by their experiences, Laura and John began sharing their journey through talks, workshops, and social media. Their message was clear. The natural world is not something to be observed from a distance. It is something to be embraced, respected, and protected. Their efforts culminated in the publication of a book titled The Pack's Legacy, A Journey of Courage and Connection. The book, co-authored with Dr. Foster, chronicled their adventures, Elena's discoveries, and the lessons they had learned from the forest. It became a bestseller, touching hearts around the world and inspiring a wave of conservation initiatives. As they reflected on their journey, Laura and John realized that the greatest gift they had received was not the recognition or success. It was the deep, unshakable bond they had formed with the forest and its inhabitants. Shadow, the pack, and Elena's spirit had shown them the power of connection, the strength of resilience, and the beauty of compassion. Years later, as they sat by the fireplace in the cabin, now a center for ecological study, Laura picked up the feather from the shrine. She held it gently, its edges softened by time, but its colors still vibrant. "Do you think Elena would be proud?" she asked. John placed a hand over hers, his eyes warm with gratitude. "I think she would. And I think she'd be glad we carried her story forward." Outside, the forest stirred with life, its rhythms as ancient as the land itself. And in the distance, a familiar howl echoed through the trees, a reminder that the bond they had forged with the wild was as enduring as the forest's timeless beauty. And if you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to our channel and comment below your thoughts and turn on the notification bell icon.